While we are waiting, how about you all drop your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. We'd love to see where you are. Good morning, Dr. Williams, here in California. See some folks in Mecklenburg, Ventura County, Oregon, Maricopa, Santa Cruz. Hi, Adrian. Spokane. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're expecting a pretty large group today. So we're so happy you all are here. Just want to double check that my sound is okay. Maddie, Xavier, can either of you give me a thumbs up? I sound good? Okay, cool. Boston, hello, Boston. Hi, Wisconsin. I hope so many of you are joining us as return guests for our second session. We kicked this off 2 months ago, and this is part 2, Lessons Along the Journey, Taking Action Toward Racial Justice and Public Health Systems. So we're gonna be learning a lot together. Hey, in Michigan. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get us started so that we do well on time. Again, thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Laquana Williams. I'm a program manager here at Prevention Institute. I'm based in our Leimert Park office when we are working in the office. Today, of course, I'm at home, true pandemic style, because we are still in it. And I'm excited to be here with all of you, learning together. We are based in Oakland and have staff members across the country who work on a wide variety of public health issues. So you'll get to hear from several of those staff members today. And I'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves when we get to that point. Okay, next slide, Maddie. The first thing we are going to do is jump into an icebreaker. I want you all to know that you are welcome in this space, that your thoughts and ideas and opinions are valued. And I also, think it's really important to model how I expect engagement in a session like this one. And so we're gonna take a deep dive really quickly, since we're gonna be talking about issues of power and change throughout today's session. The icebreaker question I have for you is, what is your practice that allows you to move forward during times of upheaval and change? Right, so that's a big, weighty question. You can be thinking about this question in terms of your work. You can be thinking about it in terms of your personal life. I'm sure a lot comes up for each of us. But what's your practice? What are you working towards that allows you to continue to move forward during times of change? And then the second part of that question is, how are you training yourself to react to changing conditions? So since we know that life is never stagnant, there's always something new to be moving towards. What are you doing? How are you training yourself to react as situations and issues change? So those are my 2 questions for you. You can feel free to drop something in the chat. If you're interested in unmuting and sharing that way, you can do that as well. So let's see. I'm going to model this question for you while folks are thinking about their answers, and I already see some coming in. For myself, I have been working towards remaining nimble so that I can course correct as issues arise. And that allows me to still continue to put one foot in front of the other. So that's something that's working for me. Let's see what's going on in the chat. Ruben, I'm actually going to ask you to share what you see coming in through the chat.
Sure, thanks, Laquana. We're seeing a lot of good responses. So folks talking about self-care and practicing openness. Somebody shared a statement: you cannot control events and actions, but you can control your reaction to those events. Being more reflective, keeping focused on values of equity, well-being, and loving kindness for yourself and for everyone. Reminding yourself of the shoulders of ancestors that you're standing on and the privilege that we have to change systems. Staying true to values, that seems to be coming up a couple of times. So yeah, some really great thoughts and really great ideas from folks in the audience.
Yeah, many thanks to all of you for responding. Is there anyone that wants to come off mute and just share a little bit more specifically? No? Okay. Just thought I'd open it up, but you all do definitely have the opportunity to engage as it makes sense for you. Okay. Thank you for participating in that. I hope that grounds each of us just a little bit in how we move forward in today's work and talking about change and power. All right, next slide. Okay, so on this slide we have a bit of our agenda for today and what we're going to go over more broadly, but it's also kind of ties into our objectives for this particular session. In session one, we looked at the history of the public health field, if you all recall. We talked about how its emphasis really set within social justice issues, that public health experts at the time, were interested in addressing community ills, and then at some point made a bit of a shift, a bit of a drastic shift that we're all seeing kind of the remnants of today. In some ways, in competition with the medical field, they made a shift towards more, towards issues that pulled away from social issues and really began looking at issues of disease, et cetera. And I think what we kind of landed on was like, there's this possibility for us as we re-envision the field of public health and we think about what's next for the field and our work, that there's a possibility that we move back to our social justice roots, that we incorporate racial justice and how meaningful it is to really center ourselves in that work. We talked about drawing connections between historical and contemporary racial justice movements and their public health impacts. We're going to do some of that today as well by sharing some updates on our timeline. And then we shared a bit about our internal learning journey around racial justice. What's really coming up for us as an organization, what's challenging, where there are opportunities for us to grow. And we had a really candid discussion about PI, our work in this area. Today, we're also going to discuss elements of cultivating authentic partnerships. We're going to look at what power sharing looks like and could look like when it's done well. And we're going to talk a little bit about efforts in response to pushback to some of the anti-racism work that's taking place in public health systems. Our goal is to draw connections between power, social justice movements, and public health. And then at the end of the session, we're going to do a little bit of a fishbowl opportunity, which is what we did in the last session, where we're going to share some emerging themes around power sharing for ourselves specifically as an intermediary organization and what's coming up around that. Sound good? Y'all all in the right space? Okay. Next slide, Maddie. All right. So we're going to kick this off by talking a bit about power and privilege. And what's interesting about this, when we were thinking about developing this session, we really thought quite a bit about the power dynamics. And I think a couple of weeks ago, I was like, it'd be interesting to talk about power and not talk about privilege. So we have an opportunity to do that here, and we're going to share with you all some insights around that for ourselves as an organization. So power is a really powerful concept. It's the ability to change your circumstances, but also the circumstances of others, right? And those two are really in tandem because power in and of itself, with just the ability to change your circumstances, is actually empowerment, which is an important tool. But power holistically is about your ability to work with others and change and assist them in theirs as well. And then privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular group or person. And this may be earned or unearned. So we're going to talk a little bit about organizational privilege on the next slide. So as we come into this work, I think that there's a recognition for a lot of us when we work in these big systems. I used to work in a health department, a local health department. I've worked in academia. And so I've been part of large systems where there are tons of privileges associated with that, right? And sometimes it even creates a bit of a disconnect it did for me, in my ability to do the work with the community, because folks in the community would be like, great, the work is great, we think you're really nice, and you work for this big system. And I recognized then that there were some areas where, some boundaries, some real clear boundaries had been drawn over the course of years, where communities had somehow been working to protect themselves from becoming close to organizations or governmental entities, because there was just this complete lack of trust. And so now, working in the nonprofit sector for Prevention Institute, the situation is a little bit different in that there is definitely more earned trust, but it doesn't mean that there isn't active work to be doing to continue to build those relationships. So at the last session, we talked a little bit about choice points, right? The ability to make different decisions and not go necessarily with the status quo. So I'm thinking about our organizational privileges. These are some of the questions we've been kind of grappling with internally. What do we understand and know about our privilege? What does it look like, right? How does it show up when we interact with others? The other question, I think, which we can draw on, Ruben, Sana, I think this probably comes up a lot in the work that you do, but how are we really leveraging our privilege towards the benefit of others? One of the ways that I think about our role in doing that is by hosting sessions like these, right? Gives us the ability to be vulnerable, to be transparent about our work, so that you all can benefit from those learning processes. Another choice point question we're asking of ourselves is, what risk does our privilege actually allow us to take? And that's an intentional choice, because the other option could be to not take any risks because things are working quite well. But what risks can we take and sustain so that we can continue to do work specifically around racial justice? We have to ask ourselves questions about the ways our privilege might actually stall or hinder us in our processes, right? In what ways does the work that we are attempting to do create roadblocks or barriers for others and or for ourselves? And then finally, what's really the balance between the privilege that we understand ourselves to have and the power that we also know we hold and have? And what does it look like to kind of straddle the line between the two of those? So these are more kind of rhetorical choice point questions for how we've been thinking about the work for ourselves around racial justice. I'm going to ask Ruben or Sana, Xavier, anyone else from PI, if there's anything you'd like to add here in relationship to what I've just shared.
I was trying to think. I was not prepared for you to pass to me, so I'll just go ahead and say, nah, I'm not prepared. I'm not just going to blurt something out that I'm not really confident in.
Okay, no worries. Um, Ruben, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, you know, I've been working in this field, in this area, you know, for quite a while, and it does take it took me a while at least to kind of recognize the organizational privilege that we bring to the table, whether it's, you know, whether I've worked for like a local organization or a statewide organization or a national organization like PI. Like, I think every place that we are kind of brings a little bit of that privilege, and it can take a while for you to kind of see it. And once that kind of like clicked for me, then the question became about, okay, then how can I leverage that privilege? That second question, how can I leverage that privilege to make sure that it's benefiting others? And a lot of times you know, one of the things I think that's really important about this body of work that we're doing is that a lot of times we think of how to leverage our privilege to help folks that are, you know, that need help, or that are less privileged than us. But I think there's also a responsibility for us to like use our privilege to work with other folks that have privilege, to get them to recognize that also, and figure out ways that they can then leverage that also to help those that, you know, have been systemically or structurally disadvantaged, and bring that up.
Yeah, I love that you shared that, Ruben. I mean, that resonates a ton with me. And I think I just add a third part to that, right? For the folks in doing advocacy work around racial justice who are much further along than we are, I think that the privilege we have is to then lift up their work, right? And there are ways that we've been really working to do that in a way that, you know, maybe we haven't always done. Like, how can we support the work of the organizations that we know are so much further and could still use, you know, our voice to support that work? So I love that you shared that. There are lots of ways we can think about our privilege, but what I really want you all to take away from this slide and this particular segment is that we all have choices in this matter, especially as it comes to racial justice, and we really have to be intentional about the ways we use our privilege and our power. The next slide actually takes us to forms of power, which we're going to talk about. Okay, so these are some definitions that you have likely seen before, especially the first one, which looks at community power building. And I want to be very clear that in no way are we saying that PI builds power in community. We don't. We're not an advocacy organization, but we do recognize and understand the benefits of community power building, and our work is to really uplift the organizations who do that work really well, right? So community power building is critical for underserved, underrepresented, historically marginalized communities who've been excluded from decision-making on policies and practices that really impact their health and their community's health. And so, you know, I think, you know, even though this is kind of a more formal definition, I think if I were to add something to it or take something away, it would be similar to what Ruben and I just discussed, right? That the privilege and the power associated with community is one that is bidirectional, right? That flows from top to bottom and is really rooted and grounded in the people and in the community. I also want to share 3 other definitions with you all, and these come from Ai-jen Poo out of the National Network. Oh my gosh, I'm going to butcher it. National Workers Alliance Network. I'm going to Google that and drop it in the chat very soon. But she looks at power dynamics. And she talks about 3 different forms of power. I know, we often in our work come across different models for what power looks like. There's a power flower, there are so many different models for it. But Eisen talks about disruptive power. And she says that disruptive power is an example of disruption that is used when a power strategy rests on withdrawing cooperation in social relations. She says that this disruptive power may be noisy, it may just be disorderly, even at times it might be violent, but it is in response to the withdrawal of cooperation, and whatever form it takes is entirely contingent upon that. She says that disruption equals an activation of interdependent power, and that protest movements really mobilize disruptive power. So disruption is not to be used just for the purposes of being disruptive, but it's really, when yielded correctly, it's used to make strategic change and implement strategic direction around the work. She says that disrupting institutions and corporations that prey upon people immediately stops the harm, while also creating a political stage to win hearts and minds. And that kind of, I think, lends itself well to the narrative power that we'll talk about in a second. The second form of power that she talks about is modeling power. And when you model power, what you do is really become a visionary and you put alternatives into the world, right? Instead of saying like, well, this is the way things have always been done. We create and strategize and envision new opportunities and we test them out, right? So when we model power, we advance new methods for sharing it. We have innovative ways to yield it. We reframe the idea that power is inherently negative, right? We become transparent and inclusive in our processes, and we work to really exercise our humility. There's a lot kind of incorporated in the self and in your organizational work when it comes to modeling power. And then the third form is narrative power. And narrative power is having the ability or the agency to tell the story of why things are the way they are in your own terms. It also includes the possibility to shape the perception, around your definition of reality, whatever that may be. So this means giving the power back to communities so that they can, share what comes up most for them in relationship to their communities and their experiences there. When there are deeply held beliefs and norms that help us make meaning of a really complex world, we have the ability to shape the public discourse, debate, and even imagery. We all know this to be true when we are in crisis mode, right? When we look at things like COVID-19 and responses to that, when we think about Hurricane Katrina, when we think about, these big national events, who is telling the story? Who gets to tell the story? Who gets to decide when we are moving forward is all kind of part of shaping the narrative. Next slide. So Alicia Garza out of the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the co-founders, says that precision around power creates clarity for how to order our steps. And I think that's just such a powerful statement because it recognizes that there's a moment in the gap to just pause a little bit so that you can gain clarity about the right next thing to do. So I want to offer that to you all as we move into the timeline piece. And I'm going to invite Xavier to introduce himself and share a little bit of an update with where we are in our the timeline that we've been building out and that we shared in the previous session. Xavier?
Thanks, Laquana. Yes, hi everyone. My name is Xavier Lofton. Working remotely from Philadelphia, unceded land of the Lenni Lenape. Working for Prevention Institute for almost 2 years now. Time in the pandemic really does fly, but the bulk of the concentration of my work has been around trying to figure out actionable steps and processes to go beyond just words, how to actually enact racial justice practices that will eventually lead to health equity across, internal and external avenues. So last time I was out here, that was 2 months ago. It's crazy that, again, time just keeps moving forward. We introduced this timeline of social resistance movements that is something that we've been trying to learn and grow from what these movements have presented in terms of operating outside of the status quo, envisioning new systems that actually create health instead of create inequities, and trying to learn what we as Prevention Institute can do from that, and as well as trying to share what we think and what we are really trying to access what others that are in our network can do to really enact racial justice practices, and again, move beyond just saying things and naming declarations. Laquana mentioned that social movements can activate the disruptive power to challenge the status quo. So that's one of the reasons that we're really trying to root a lot of our thinking in contemporary as well as historical social movements. So in a sense, this process of sharing is in a way mirroring what we've seen through these social movements and try to mirror that shared learning. Back in August, we drafted a timeline draft broken down to these 4 categories, and we've named them categories based on just our available resources, the alignment of our work, and the things that we were able to find through our research and in our conversations with community partners. I noted last time out that showing our work in progress was an intentional decision to deviate from the status quo. So again, with this, thanks to William K. Kellogg Foundation for creating the room in the form of funding specifically for this type of work, we are now able to model this alternative form of shared learning. Because knowledge, as we know, the saying is true, it's corny, but knowledge is power, and you can really use power to activate change within levers, pulling levers within your communities. So as I go through today's content on economic liberation, I would encourage you all to think through the ways that you can leverage your your organizational privileges to support growing power within the communities that you work with. And then for those of you with sharp eyes and good memories, you might notice that this screenshot is just a little bit different than the last time we showed it, because as promised, we have been adapting our thinking and our framing as our understanding grows. So again, we're putting our money where our mouths are, and we are trying to do our best to model this new way of sharing information. So as we dive deeper into the economic liberation movement, into the economic liberation category, viewing this through the lens of power, we saw economic justice to be just one piece of this economic liberation category that we've now framed it as. So with economic liberation, we are talking about an alternative to the status quo. We're talking about we're talking about an economy that prioritizes the wisdom, the freedom, and the experience of communities of color, those that have been historically denied economic advancement. This is, again, about processes. It's about processes that can now instead actually promote full freedom of economic opportunities. And that's exactly where the liberation piece comes into play. It's about full freedom and the ability to live to the fullest of all aspects of the social environment that we have created. And by centering the experience of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities very explicitly in developing these alternative processes to disrupt the status quo, we can actually have economic and educational policies, systems, and institutions that promote that full freedom of opportunity. So while we won't get to focus on necessarily all of these today, I did want to keep all of these 4 categories, all of these 4 social movements up to frame how we have been thinking about the elements that make up economic liberation. So if we're thinking about labor justice, that's about systems that promote a fair workforce that allows for them to have full economic opportunity and appropriate compensations for the services that they have worked. In terms of economic justice, we're talking about what is taught in the public education system and the way that it is taught in the public education system. Because since about World War II, there's been about one way that we've done things, how there are certain ideological thoughts of a different way of doing things, but public education in the United States has largely remained the same for near a century at this point. And then when we're talking about access to education, I think that's a little more simple. That's just about the fair distribution of funds and resources, benefits and burdens. But today, what we're going to focus on is economic justice. So as we go deeper into that bubble, we're going to recognize that the US was founded on white supremacist principles that created the capitalistic systems that disadvantage groups and advantage one group. That means the wealth was created and maintained where it already existed based on the foundations of this country, and it was near impossible to build that wealth where it was not. So advocates for economic justice are seeking these alternatives to capitalism. They're favoring systems that create, again, full economic opportunities for Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, because as we know, the status quo currently does not operate in that way. That is one way that we have tried to encapsulate what it means and what it looks like to try and move towards economic liberation. And these include things like generational wealth, economic stability, and freedom from the oppressive grip of capitalism. Now, we know that capitalism creates winners and losers. It is a system that we have been told is the only way to do things, but it's only the way that we have been taught to do things. We have not been taught so many other ways that can be rooted in the practices of Indigenous communities that are more based in abundance, more based in community, and more based in healing and hope. So that is something that is an intentional shift that we are trying to harness. It's not always easy to pick it out in how organizations operate, but if we can try and go back to that, thinking about power and the ways that we can leverage power, I think there's plenty of opportunities for organizations to get in and access and harness and amplify what these boots on the ground organizations that are actively fighting for racial justice, to amplify what they're already doing. We don't have to do things on top of one another. What we have to do is recognize our role, our privilege, and our power, and support in areas where we know less, or where it is not our space to be leading the fight. Now, this big looming category with the asterisk you saw, we're going to talk about reparations. And again, this is not a history lesson. This is not talking about what it means and how we necessarily haven't gotten there yet, but we're talking about the steps that we have gotten to get us closer there. So reparations in definition actually just means the making of amends for past wrongs through some sort of compensation. I think a lot of people tend to get pigeonholed into reparations immediately means money. And then people, whenever that topic is brought up, nobody wants to touch it after that. That, I'm just going to make that explicit because I think that is something that anytime this issue comes up, no matter who is saying it, there are definitely visceral emotional reactions that shut down the conversation and prevent logic from ever coming through. So the reason we chose to focus on reparations for slavery specifically is the long documented history of inequities that resulted directly from slavery and the poor treatment of formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants. The issue here, obviously, being that from the minute that the first enslaved African person was put to work and not paid for their services, it built this natural power imbalance that continues today in the United States. So the act of resistance here, I'm choosing to focus through the formation of a group known as the National African American Reparations Commission. So the formation of this group I'm choosing as the act of resistance, in that it formalizes the efficacy, it formalizes the value, the worth of exploring alternatives to capitalism, which is doing nothing to account for the fact that hundreds of years of enslavement of a group of people has resulted in a lot of lost taxpayer dollar that a lot of people fight over, but more so just prevented opportunities, to keep it simple. So the focus of this group, I've just taken directly from their website. This group is a group of national Black professionals across various fields, various professions, united in a common commitment to fight for reparatory justice, compensation, and restoration of African American communities. They go further to say, those that were plundered by historical crimes of slavery, segregation, colonialism, and that continue to be victimized by the legacies of slavery and American apartheid. So they're not pulling any punches here. They are very, very clear about what their purpose is and what they are trying to do. And in addition to advocating for supporting policies and alternatives to trying to repair the relationships due to the history of slavery and segregation in this country, besides advocating for the House Bill 40 that would actually create a national group that is federally regulated to study this, to learn about how different communities may be trying to address their studies or try, excuse me, I'm gonna take a pause because I got a little too ahead of myself. So in addition to the national level of things, this group also advocates for state level things that are already going on. California's created a statewide task force to develop and share proposals for reparations, and they're supposed to be making their recommendations to the state within the next year. But this group, the National African American Reparations Commission, is advocating for more time because they barely have had a year to do this, and that's clearly not enough time to think about how to account for 400 years of inequities. So in addition to amplifying the voices of state level agencies, they also support and communicate with local level agencies and localities that are trying to do similar things, that are trying to repair the relationships in the communities that they work with, and really trying to account for the honest and full history of this country. So I threw a lot out at you, but I did ask for you to think about the ways that you or your organization can leverage your power to shift narratives. And I'm just going to go ahead and ask now, please, in the chat, or if you do feel comfortable enough, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. And I'd ask you to share how have you or your organization try to disrupt these harmful narratives about your community or model alternative practices to sharing power. Johnny, I see you got your hand raised and you had a great comment before, so I'm going to try and pull you onto the stage.
Testing.
Johnny, you're good.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. So I'm a clinical psychologist and also independent systems change consultant, and wanted to share an exciting story about alternative practices of power sharing with a work group that I'm leading for the Central Coast Regional Equity Study. And we've identified 4 pillars to move forward for cross-sector collaboration. The first is trusting cross-sector relationships. The second is acknowledgement of power and privilege, which I put the definition in the chat earlier. And those 2 are needed to get to the third step, which is successful reciprocal collaboration, which we've just defined as giving and receiving to build resource sharing alliances, promote a collective narrative, and catalyze grassroots alliances and organic organizing efforts. So this pillar is really founded in the spirit of reciprocity, based on my Indigenous worldview of we are all interdependent with each other in the natural world. So how do we use that interdependence for reciprocating and really giving and receiving, and in a good way and in a humble way? And then the fourth one is sustainable resource circulation, which is defined as circulating resources reliably and consistently to produce data-driven actions that achieve measurable results. So how to not be afraid of resource circulation and acknowledging the power and privilege that we have, and having the generosity of giving resources for this interdependent community-based connection. So I just wanted to highlight that and just celebrate that with all of you as something that's happening in the Central Coast for a model for our regional equity plan for alternative practices of power sharing.
Those are wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. Absolutely awesome.
No, I
There's
love that.
Yeah,
I think
really, really strong pillars. Yeah, I appreciate that and want to lift those up around trust, acknowledging power, collaboration and reciprocity, and sustaining resource circulation. Beautiful. There's a couple of comments in the chat about community-based participatory research and having true engagement from the start. Absolutely. That's definitely an alternative method of power sharing. And I would just add to that, if I can, I think when it comes to CVPR, looking to institutions and researchers of color and really lifting up the work that they are doing in this space, despite how challenging it is to work either within the academy or to have opportunities for publishing, is something like we got to work on that end of it too. But you're absolutely right. The work that is being done in communities through CVPR is a fantastic example of this. Anybody else want to add? From our team too, y'all are welcome to add. But I know we're about to jump into our fishbowl conversation, so maybe we can just keep moving there. Xavier, are you all wrapped up, or you have some closing thoughts on this section?
No, I mean, I think Johnny made a better point than I would have brought up. That's in thinking about choice points, that's like 100-pound weight lifted there. But I would just say that in addition to those big lifts, there are really small things that you can do from your place as an organization. I also come from a local health department, and one of the ways that we tried to kind of model these power sharing practices was with a community advisory board that was not at all filled with people with degrees and titles. It was, in the neighborhoods and the areas that we worked with. And really the idea was to use this group to start our conversations around what is it that we want to do, as opposed to bringing an idea or an already finished product or some grant funding that had already been applied for and written for, and then saying, well, now we have this thing for you. So just really creating those processes to actually have your programs, policies, your practices just rooted in what it is, the wants and the needs and desires of the communities that you work with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing, Xavier. It looks like we have another hand raised. I think we have a moment to take a hand from Charmaine.
Hi, so I am from the National Reach Coalition as well as from Bronx Health Reach Institute for Family Health. And I, in response to the question that's there on our screen and sort of picking up, Laquana, on what you started off talking about narrative power. So I just wanted to share that the National Reach Coalition back in the spring, around April, launched an initiative, Who Tells Our Stories Shapes Our Destiny. And so we had actually had somebody outside of the United States, somebody from Canada, a professor who is from one of the native tribes there, talk about this, both from the research work that she's doing, as well as from her personal experience as a member of one of the native tribes. And then we sponsored a training on digital storytelling with people from different parts of the country. And we had we said we had a premiere in June where people from different parts of the country, also from different racial and ethnic groups, talked, shared their digital stories, some of them that were personal to them in terms of race and ethnicity, some of them in terms of the work that they're doing to advance racial and ethnic equity. So I just wanted to share that quickly, that we've been paying particular attention to the telling of the story. Who gets to tell your story is also the very powerful person who then gets to also shape your destiny. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, Charmaine, and as an example. I think folks can learn quite a bit from that. And it's really not necessarily about learning how to do something new, but really about grounding ourselves in what makes us all human, and you know, the fact that we are all people. So I think I want to encourage everyone to think about some of these approaches as not an additional thing to do, but really a grounding in our humanness. And I think your example is beautiful, as well as Kiki's example in the chat. So thank you both for sharing. Okay. So now in, you know, our efforts around, you know, our potential for sharing our work and our transparency and vulnerability in that, our small Kellogg team, me, Ruben, Xavier, Sana, Maddie, have called on several of our other colleagues to come and join us for a deep dive in some of their project work, and to share a little bit about how power and privilege kind of shows up in the work that they are doing with community. So I'm going to invite Dana and Rachel to hop online and to maybe in a minute or so just introduce yourselves to the group, your name, and share a little bit about the work that you do here at PI. Maybe we're going to start with Rachel, because Rachel, because I said Rachel. I was going to go with D for Dana because, you know, the alphabet, but I said Rachel. So Rachel, how about you kick it off?
We're going reverse alphabetical order. Dana, you can speak on the question first. How about that? Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and share some reflections on my work with Prevention Institute and with many, many incredible community partners. My name is Rachel Cushing Bennett, and I am a proud native of Oakland, California, where I am based. And my background is in both public health and urban planning, really looking at how city and regional planning decisions and public policies have influenced communities' abilities to be healthy and safe. So I've been with Prevention Institute for almost a decade now. Feel incredibly lucky to work with this group of people that I trust and share values with and have fun with and are working with and fighting for a better future. And I'm really honored to be here with all of you, sort of in this space of mutual sharing and learning together. This is not just about us imparting what we have learned and perfected. Xavier, this is something you've been saying a lot. It's not about hitting the perfection before we share. This is just about, we're a big learning community. So it's an honor to have a chance to share my work.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dana Fields Johnson, and I'm an associate program director with PI. I've been with Prevention Institute for a little over 6 years, which is really hard to believe. And I've spent most of my career working in and within public health systems, right? Just to give a little background, I've worked in a local health department for 5 years. So I truly consider myself a public health champion. But when I think about my work historically, I feel like I've been doing equity and justice work the whole time, right? And I think that's where I connect closest to the work. And so like you, Rachel, I feel incredibly fortunate to be at Prevention Institute. And to have the opportunity to work on these issues at a larger scale, right? And to be able to work with communities across the country. And the work that I do with PI that I am most proud of is the work that is connecting me more closely with grassroots community, right? As we talk about this issue of what equitable power sharing looks like, it looks like a shifting and moving power away from just agencies and organizations to really drawing community closer in to decision-making and holding seats of power. So I am really looking forward to this fishbowl conversation. I work in our safety and well-being portfolio mostly, which is where we work to bring a public health and prevention lens to mental health and well-being, more and more substance use and misuse, and then also community safety and violence. And thank you, I'm happy to be here. And thank you, Kwana.
Of course. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so inside information, I love everybody I work with here at PI, but I have a special place in my heart for these two, which is why I was reaching out to them saying, come on, let's do this. Let's, share, let's be vulnerable. Let's talk about what we're learning. So we developed some really hard questions that I hope will give you all some thoughts and ideas about the way we're working through some of the challenges and opportunities we're experiencing. So jumping right in, the first question is, what do you see as PI's role and responsibility to the field of public health and to organizations we are partnering with that are in more direct relationship to community? So in other words, what is our offering? What do we have to give? What are we bringing in your work with community?
Yeah, that's a really tough and great question, right? If we really want to be honest here. And for me, one of the things that I think we are bringing is a willingness to put ourselves in a posture of organizational humility, right? The posture of being able to truly listen and hear when we're at the table and embrace new perspectives and approaches. And I think that is what is going to be needed if we really are authentically wanting to move and shift power, right? I think it also is going to require us to, I think the other thing we do, and this is an excellent example of it, is create, and I'm going to borrow, I say safe spaces, but I'm going to borrow from one of our other colleagues at PI who talks about brave spaces, right? Because these can be really uncomfortable conversations when we really start asking organizations and organizational leaders and systems, right, to let go of some of that power, right, and to bring the communities who they've harmed, marginalized, or excluded in many ways from decision making. This can be really uncomfortable for them, even when they say, we want or we're prioritizing racial justice and racial equity, right? I think what people don't get is it's not just a statement or a goal, right? It's a practice. I love and I can't remember who it was, I'm so sorry, who shared their 4 pillars, right? For how the regional equity group was going to work together, because it is a practice, right? It is a practice of including conversations about racial equity and racial justice in everything we do, right? But then it's about what are those practices that are going to get us there, right? Those difficult conversations that we have to create spaces for. I am going to pause there and give Rachel a chance to weigh in.
Thanks, Dana. I think this is generational work, someone said we're standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, which is true. And I love bringing that in. I also think, we're standing on the shoulders of movements that have been working for a long, long time. So when I think about what those of us that are working towards racial justice and envisioning a different world are up against, the question I ask myself and that I ask of Prevention Institute is, how can we be useful? I love Prevention Institute. I love the people I work with, and I believe in this work. For me, it's rooted in my personal values. And like anything or anyone I love, I want us to be the best we can be. I want us to be useful, and I want us to be true to what we say. And that's not always easy. It's not easy for me personally. It's not easy for us as an institution. I'm sure you all, many of you can relate to that as well. So I really appreciate that, the point, Dana, that you made about it's a practice. I think one thing I'll just share personally, it took me a very long time to realize that I already had a practice. You know, being trained in public health, there is a practice. You start with the problem identification, you back it up with data, you know, you do your analysis, you make a conclusion, you allocate resources, you do your evaluation. There's a practice. It's become internalized for me, for a lot of us. And so learning new ways of thinking, learning new ways of working is challenging, especially when there are still a lot of incentives to do things the way things have always been done. So, you know, that notion of the status quo is really real. And it's something that is deep and I think about. And I'm not sure that I always do the best I can do. But, you know, I think in the spirit of honest sharing, we're trying. And I think talking about it and being honest is really important. I want to pause there. I have a couple more things to say, but Dana, I just want to invite you to reflect more.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am so glad somebody just talked about discomfort in the chat, right? Because I think a part of our practice is really going to be about being willing to sit in discomfort. You cannot have change without friction, right? And the friction that's going to come along with sharing power, right? Inviting people into seats of power. And in the public health system, wherever you sit in it, you know, we're used to wearing our cap of expert, right? And our, you know, and these wonderful skills that we bring to things. But guess what? Like they're not what is going to get us to racial justice, right? That's not what's going to get us there. And so I think a part of the organizational humility practice that I'm talking about is asking who does community want to lead, right? Because I think that we may get a different answer, right? And when we get that, you know, we have to really ask ourselves, how can we be supporters using our power and privilege for good, right? To support what community wants, but not necessarily be in the seat of power or leading the work.
One thing that's scary about this work is, I think, the fear of being irrelevant. I think giving up some of our own power, or, you know, in terms of public health, recognizing, this is painful when I realized this years ago during my training, so much of what determines individual and community health is way outside the purview of what people working in public health can actually control. And so I think everyone wants to feel relevant. I think everyone wants to feel like their perspective is valued. And I think it's okay for those of us working in the public health system to feel like we're playing a part. We can be useful, you know, if community or community-based organizations are asking for data, that's a resource we can provide. If they're asking for narrative power, you know, we can, rather than taking the mic and telling the story, we can find ways to amplify the narratives and the stories that, you know, that communities are already telling. If it's about bringing partners to the table or funding to the table, there's a lot that we can do that doesn't have to position us as the ones calling all the shots. And so I think, you know, just sort of getting creative and feeling secure that we, as public health folks, we bring value, but we don't have to be front and center, leading the conversation, expecting things to go a certain way and doing things the way we were taught that they need to be done if they're going to be done right. It's not necessary. I think we've seen what that leads to. And if we want things to be different, we have to do things differently. And I think, it can be scary, but it's also exciting because, we would be building something different and maybe something transformative.
Yeah, I love your comments there, both of your comments, Rachel and Dana. And I think what it reminds me of is that if we ourselves, if we can have the ability to kind of shed some of our, I don't know what to call it, some of our indoctrination into this work, then that is the thing that allows us to really connect with people, right? And that doesn't mean that our institutions formally change everything that they do, because I do think that the work of power building really stays and should sit with community. Doesn't mean that we co-opt it. But it allows us to listen to the needs of community, I think, with a different ear, right? If we remember and retrain ourselves to think about ourselves as people first and the work as, impactful for generations to come. Dana, I think I jumped in. It looked like you were going to say something. Were you going to add something?
Yeah, but thank you for jumping in. I was trying to read Joni's, I think it's Johnny or Joni, I'm so sorry. The idea of healthy discomfort versus unsafe discomfort. And I'm so intrigued by that. I really want to kind of explore that a little bit. What I know is, and what I've seen in our work, particularly and what we talk about as our learning communities or our communities of practice, and one in particular that we're working with down in Houston that has stated in explicit principles around how we do this work that call out not just talking about, but acting on health justice, that call out principles around shared decision-making and leadership, sharing the and community being in those positions. And we've been doing that work now since 2019. And I think that where we are now in the work, we have a few more years to go, but where we are now in it, I'm seeing, I'm really feeling this discomfort, right? And it's making me a little jittery, right? It's jarring me a little bit, but I know that these are the conversations that have to be had. Some of it, and I saw somebody mention in the chat earlier, so I really want to acknowledge this because I think we would be hypocritical to say that you just need to be brave and you need to go do this within a system, within the public health system, knowing I've been there, that there are leaders who are holding more power than you may feel or experience within that system. But I do still think there are things that you can do, right? There are opportunities to take some of these questions that our team put out earlier about power and privilege and have internal explorations about those in small groups, in smaller teams, in your divisions and your departments. And then really invite leadership in to be a part of those conversations, right? I think a lot of this, focus on shifting power and acknowledging our privilege and our racial justice practice requires that look in the mirror, right? And I think people are safer at first doing that internally, but it will require you to be vulnerable and to be courageous with your partners, right? Because I don't think you can build trust with community and with your external partners unless you're willing to be vulnerable in those conversations and to do things differently, right? To approach things differently and listen to approaches that may not be your norm.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. And thank you for responding to a difficult question in the chat, because
something we
like
talked
you
about.
Acknowledged.
Yeah, we talked about that. I said this in our planning sessions, like we haven't been in a public health system. That's just hard when you feel like you only are responsible for this little piece over here and there are all these people up here, right? One of the other things I want to go back to, Laquana, if it's okay, and I know we have questions, but somebody brought this up in the chat too, like the idea of implicit power. And this has come up in our work in Houston as well, where people might not be walking in their positional power or feeling like they're doing that, but there's an implicitness that people offer or extend to you based on who you're with or your title and all these other things. And so a part of that, looking in the mirror, I think, is about acknowledging where you may have implicit power and, you know, how that can serve the work, but also how it can act as a barrier.
I'm glad you added that, because that takes us right into our next question.
Oh, okay, I
which
love
is
that.
which is our chance to get, you know, to be introspective about how PI's relationship to power sharing and partnerships, like what that actually looks like. What do we do well, and where are there opportunities for us to grow, right? How would you all describe our relationship, our organizational relationship to power sharing and to partnerships?
I'm looking at you,
Who's
Rachel.
kicking
I'll
us
talk
off?
last. I don't want to.
It doesn't have to be.
I want to share this space equitably.
Dana, it's so interesting that you said for a lot of people, it starts looking internally. I actually think it's harder to look internally.
Oh, it's harder, but it means to start there. Oh, it's definitely harder.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to go back to something Laquana said earlier, which is, you know, prevention and we're not a community power building organization. We are an organization that has power in a number of ways, but you know, power building is sort of hot in philanthropy right now. And we have asked ourselves, my team, we've asked ourselves, you know, when there's a grant opportunity that comes up that is about power building, like we don't go for that because we're not a power building organization and we don't want to co-opt that and we don't want to claim to be something we're not. So I think, again, being honest about that, it's just facts, and that's okay. And we talk about how do we support community power building, knowing that that really is fundamental to this work. You know, I am managing a national initiative called People, Parks, and Power, or P3, that's funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. And it's amazing. I mean, it sort of builds on direct advocacy that Prevention Institute and a coalition of partners have done over many years in Los Angeles County to advance park equity. So, you know, taking a look at all neighborhoods in the county and seeing where there's park access and where there's not, and understanding the legacy of public policies and public finance decisions that have led to those inequities in green space access, you know, understanding that parks are really crucial for health. So we're sort of bringing that to scale on a national level and funding 14 base building groups, community organizing groups in cities across the country to take on the issue of park and green space equity themselves. So what I really cherish about that work is a few things. One is the opportunity to help redistribute resources. We've been talking about narrative power and visioning things being different. I think the environmental field in general has been dominated by white perspectives for so long, going back to its roots, seeing nature as something separate or something to be conquered, or seeing land as something to be owned, and city planning in ways where you have to put certain things in certain places, and certain neighborhoods are essentially sacrifice zones. We're trying to flip that on its head by not just resourcing groups that have always worked on the issue of parks, because that's such a single issue focus. Like it's about parks, but it's not just about parks. It's about power. And it's about community rooted organizations exercising their power and turning out their people and building that people power to say, hey, among many issues, whether it's economic justice, whether it's education justice, whether it's clean air, clean water, affordable housing, elder care, any of these things, to demand fairness and justice. Parks, and green spaces and trees are really important, but they're just one of the many ways that imbalances in power have really manifested in communities. So I feel very privileged that we get to work with funders that have a lot of resources, and we get to help redistribute some of those resources and lift up narratives about different ways of doing this work than the ways that have always been done, excuse me. At the same time, I want to acknowledge, kind of the whole, going back to Xavier's point about economic justice, economic liberation. We're all in the nonprofit world, or many of you are in the government world. Like, there's a way that this work gets done. We're all hustling after grants. We're doing sort of like grant to grant funding. And it is a grant making initiative. It's sort of temporary in nature. And I don't always know how to square that with the fact that this work is about movement building and long-term power building. So I think we're making progress towards not just episodic funding and not just funder directed work, but I think there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, I'm really appreciating all of that, Rachel, because I do think that a part of this requires us to show up differently again, not as grant managers, project or program managers, experts, but as strong and courageous, I think, partners to community, right? And I think a lot of what you were saying about, a lot of this still being kind of tied to grants is so important, because I think one of PI's, one of the ways we are exercising our privilege is through using that ear that we have of funders, right? And funding agencies, and really helping them to see the value of community-defined, community-led, community-driven approaches, right, to the work. But I think we're also, and this is a challenge for us, but we're really having to push them to be more flexible, right? This type of change and community transformation work does not happen overnight, right? And it's not tied to a work plan or a timeline, right? And this is a lot about trust building and relationship building. And so I think, I think we use our privilege and power. I hate saying we use our power, right? It just, but I think we are willing to stand in our power in that way, and I appreciate that. But it is not always easy, right? Because we're changing norms within philanthropy and within public health, and norms don't change overnight.
Yeah, absolutely not. I know we have more questions, but I want to pause and see if anything is coming up for the audience. Anybody want to unmute and ask a question of Dana or Rachel or any of us? What's coming up for y'all online? Feel free to raise your hand or enter the chat. And if not, I don't think I'm seeing anything. We can keep going because we still have lots of discussion. So the next question is, given your projects, what can we say we know or understand in this moment about our racial justice work and practice? And in what ways are we really trying to remain nimble, and are we course correcting when we learn something different? So I can say, this is definitely coming up in my project work where, we may write a grant a certain way and have ideas about the way the work is going to shape up. And then in real time, we're learning that, oh, maybe there's something else we should be paying attention to. And suddenly we have to course correct for that. And in some ways it feels scary and feels like everything has gone by the wayside. But the truth is that there are real learnings to explore that underpin all of that. So, what are you all learning about our racial justice work in working with communities?
Wow, so much. I think we are constantly learning and evolving from the work we are doing in communities. And I think we're learning how to be more accountable in some ways to what we say we are trying to do, right? I think communities hold us accountable for not just talking, but walking the walk as well. They require us to be vulnerable. I think they require us to sit in discomfort too with them. And I think it's so interesting because I think we're also learning that collaboration and partnership is soft, right? I want to go, I don't just want to say that. I think just asking people to partner and collaborate is soft. How we bring people into the work. And I'm thinking about our communities of care work in Houston, where we're working with 10 different collaboratives. And like Rachel said, they called out one thing like parks equity or education equity, but they're learning that the work is so much bigger, right? But they're all working towards racial justice is what I would say, right? But we asked for these formed community collaboratives, but what we found out was, that whoever the grantee organization was, there was this relationship of power that's not healthy in this work. And I have to call that out because a lot of the struggles that our collaboratives have experienced have been in trying to kind of shift that power more to community. So we're learning about what the structures look like, I think, that support power sharing and community-led work.
Thanks, Dana. I like that a lot. I think that we are learning that it's one thing to name racial justice as a desired outcome, as as the guiding value of the work. I think it's another to understand how to work in racially just ways. It's something, it's not only about, yeah, right? Like
It's a practice, Rachel.
It's a practice. And it's, I think there's a lot to unlearn. I think there's a lot to learn. And that's complicated. You know, I'm like, I think I'll say me personally, I am on that journey, but like, it's a long journey, especially as a white person. I think institutionally we're on that journey. And again, I'm really glad that we're talking about this and sort of sharing in the spirit of a learning community, because I think a lot of folks are on that journey and trying to figure out, like, I don't know if we've always been incentivized to do things a certain way. If that's the way how things are done, what would it mean for me personally? What would it mean for our institution? What would it mean for the work if we really did try something different? One thing I wanted to mention, this is an aside, is I've started diving into the work of an artist and a healer named Trisha Hersey. She started something called the Nap Ministry, which is, you know, sort of like a funny title. I think it's kind of attention getting, but pretty profound what she's talking about, which is that, back to Xavier's point, you know, in this system of capitalism, we are always trying to be productive, and that envisioning a different world and how we could get there in practice takes rest. It takes stepping away from the grind. You know, she's like fighting back against grind culture. And so many of us in government and in nonprofit and working on social justice issues, like grind culture is all we know. It's the righteous struggle, right? I love that what she says is, in order to connect to the divine in each of us, and in order to connect to our shared humanity, that interconnectedness that Johnny mentioned, we need to rest at times also, so we can dream. And so I just wanted to offer that. It's been inspiring me just in my own personal life lately and in my work, stepping back from that day to day and thinking and really listening to folks who have thought about this a lot more than I have, who've been working on this for years. But I offer that in case it inspires anyone else. I'll drop her name and her website in the chat. I would encourage folks to work on, or to check that out. But yeah, I mean, I think culture change is going to take time, but it's critical. It's critical that we do this. We have to do this. And we're lucky to do this. So I'm glad that we're talking about the piece that each of us can do in ourselves and in our institutions.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Dana. I'm going to go back to those of you who are on the line to see if you have any questions or comments for Rachel or Dana or anyone. And while you all are thinking about that or pressing the button to raise your hands, I just want to recap a little bit of what I'm taking away, which is about accountability, vulnerability, and transparency in this work, staying with the discomfort and being willing to wrestle with healthy tensions, which I think is such a beautiful thing. We have to create a space and container to really work through the difficult things rather than turning away from them. There's also something really special and really revolutionary in our slowing down, right? How do we take necessary pause and necessary care? That's something I've been working on in my personal life too, Rachel. So I'm so happy that you brought up Trisha's work with the Nap Ministry. So she's going to be here in LA this weekend. Shout out to her. But anyway, anything coming up for anyone in the audience? I am not seeing anything. Go ahead, Dana, were you going to say something?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, for sharing Trisha's work. And something was coming up for me around the word progress, right? And I just, I think in this quest for justice, we're going to have to define progress differently, right? And have different measures of impact and change, right? That keep us in this work. Because if we try to keep using the same colonial ways of evaluating and measuring, we're setting this work up for failure. So I hope that I think that we at PI have tried really hard to bring into conversations with funders different metrics, different measures of thinking about what impact and success looks like, right? And it's not just how we're defining it, but it's about really how community is defining it. And so community has to be a part of those conversations, but we have to rethink the idea of progress and success too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Rachel. Y'all are phenomenal. Thank you for doing the work that you do. I think we've learned a ton from each of you today, and we really appreciate you. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Xavier to close us out. We're almost at the top of the hour.
Thanks, Laquana. And yeah, just echoing the thoughts and sentiments there. Rachel, Dana, appreciate you both just coming on and sharing your reflections. Because if nothing else, you're the expert in your own experience. And if that's nothing more than what you're sharing, I think that's an abundance of knowledge that you've just given out. So 2 months from now, on December 15th, we will be hosting the series finale of this learning series. We're going to get into a little bit about some of the policy opportunities. That's both big P in terms of external policies, as well as little p, like some of the things that we talked about today, the internal policies and practices and the ways that shape the work internally and are reflected externally in terms of what you do with others and in communities. Also, keep an eye out next week. We'll be sending out the recordings, any materials that we think might be helpful between now and the next session. And please keep an eye out and tell us again how great we did today. Evaluations are a real key part of making sure that we're actually giving you what you want, and making sure that we are being receptive to what it is that, the path that you would like us to take. So we're trying to, again, keep flipping the script and not be prescriptive in terms of what it is that we're going to share. We want to be a little bit flexible, a little bit nimble, and be responsive to the people that we serve, which in this instance is all of you. Thank you again. You can see our names on the side here, and the slides that we send out will have all of our information. So thanks again for joining, and I hope to see you just before the end of the year.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, y'all.
Thanks, everybody, for the wonderful reflections and information you shared. I've got so much to think about now coming off of this. Thank you.
Take care of yourself. Yes, Leticia, we can pull links and everything from the chat. We are recording that as well, so we'll definitely include that as materials.